I want to speak about value theory, about Marxian value theory. And when we speak about this issue, there is a traditional view in which this issue seems to be rather easy, rather simple. There is a labor theory of value already formulated by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Marx accepts this labor theory of value and brings it to a peak. Maybe he's the top guy in this list, but essentially very often it is seen as a kind of unity. Smith, Ricardo, Marx, they had essentially the same labor theory of value, which nowadays is opposed to a marginal utility theory of value. But this very simple view is not at all correct. On the one hand, when you read carefully Smith and Ricardo, you can see that there is not just one labor theory of value which tells us labor creates value. The things are more complicated, but unfortunately today my issue is Marx and not Smith and Ricardo. Therefore, I will not go in depth in this point. I just mention it. Also with the classical economists, it is not so easy with labor theory of value. What I will stress is that Marx is not just a representative of the labor theory of value. By the way, he never mentioned this term. He never speaks of labor theory of value. He only speaks of value theory. So I want to stress that Marx is not just a representative. In some respect, he is a critic of this classical labor theory of value, but because since the end of the 19th century we have this big conflict between objective labor theory of value on the one hand, utility theories on the other hand, the differences, the critique of Marx against Smith and Ricardo is underestimated. And I want to highlight these differences in order to highlight certain aspects of Marx's value theory, which are already mentioned in the title of the lecture, Fetishism and Impersonal Rule. So, what are now the differences? What are now the big achievements of Marx's value theory? At first, and this maybe is not questioned very much, there is a difference in scope. When you read Smith and Ricardo, what is for them the interesting point, what they want to understand? It is they want to explain the quantitative exchange relations. Why commodity A exchanges with commodity B in a relation two times A against 1 time B. Marx's scope, when he speaks about value theory, is not just a quantitative exchange relation. Marx's scope of interest, of analysis, is much deeper. He understands value theory as a social theory, a theory which explains us how a society or an economy can work in which, on the one hand, the producers are dependent on each other because of the division of labor, but on the other hand, these producers behave as if they were lonesome Robinsons. They produce privately, independently from each other. So what is this, and when we are so used to this that maybe we not even see how crazy this situation is, that you on the one hand depend on each other, but on the other hand you negate, you ignore this dependence. So when Marx speaks of value theory, it is not just a limited economic theory, it is a theory or a consideration how this kind of economy and society is possible. It exists, but how is this possible? So this, his value theory, is already by this different scope a part of his critical project. When you read Capital, you should take care of the subtitle of the book. It's not only Capital, the subtitle is Critique of Political Economy. Political economy in these times was just the usual term for economics, or what we call nowadays economics, economic sciences. And when Marx uses the subtitle Critique of Political Economy, then this means that he not just criticized certain theories, he criticized, or he made at least the attempt to criticize, a whole science. And how can you criticize a whole science and not only a single theory? You criticize a whole science insofar you put into question what is taken for granted in this science. What is taken so much for granted that it seems not even necessary to discuss it or to give reason for this. And this critical project in Marx starts already with value theory. In the first chapter of Capital about the commodity, Marx gives us a very valuable consideration on this. In this section, in this subsection on fetishism, he writes that the classical political economy more or less correctly found the content of the form of the commodity, meaning they found that the value is determined by labor. But, he added then, they, the classical political economists, they never asked why this content, labor, takes this form, value. They take this for granted. Why they did take this for granted? Because they take commodity production for granted. And Marx doesn't take commodity production for granted, he takes it as a special social form which has to be analyzed as such a special form. And this starts with his value theory. Insofar, to say Marx has a different scope in his value theory, he not only wants to explain quantitative exchange relations, but he sees it as a social theory, is already a basic critique to this science of political economy. And not only the point that he had a different scope. But that he puts in question such basic things is not restricted to the scope. The next point he puts in question is labor itself. It is well known that Adam Smith, as an answer to the question what determines the exchange value of a commodity, denied the, in these times, traditional answer that the exchange value of a commodity is determined by the utility of the commodity. Adam Smith, with his famous example of water and diamonds, water is so useful for man, but has such a small exchange value. Diamonds have a big exchange value and is not so useful. By this example, he denied the old utility theory and produced a new theory, this labor theory of value, that the labor which is necessary to produce something, that this labor is the reason for exchange value. This starting point of the classical labor theory of value, Marx already criticized. He criticized the not critical treatment of labor, just to take labor, as labor is something very simple which needs no more questions. He starts with the twofold character of the commodity as a use value and exchange value, and he simply draw the consequence: when the commodity has a twofold character, then also the commodity producing labor has to be a twofold character. On the one hand, labor which produces use value. On the other hand, the same labor constitutes the value. Labor which produces use value is the concrete labor, the labor we observe when we see how a person is working. The labor which produces value we cannot observe. And this now is the critical point against the classics, that labor which produces value is abstract labor. Value is an abstraction. It is the abstraction from the different use values of different commodities. It is the abstraction which gives us an abstract economic unity called value. And this is a pure social unity, this value, in opposite to the use value. In use value, it depends from the natural attributes of the things. Value is a pure social entity, and so the consequence Marx draw, also abstract labor which produces value is a pure social entity, and in no case something natural or something which exists in every society. In many Marxist discussions, this twofold character of commodity producing labor is mentioned, but it is not really used. It is, I think, in some respect, it is neglected. Just it is seen as a kind of refinement. The classics speak of labor as such. Marx divides labor in concrete labor producing use value, abstract labor producing value. But this difference has a very fundamental meaning, and Marx himself points to this fundamental meaning in Capital. When you read the first chapter of Capital, you find the nice sentence there that Marx mentions this double character of commodity producing labor was first discovered by myself. It is the decisive point to understand anything in political economy. It is very rare that Marx applauds to himself in such a way that he said, oh, I'm the first guy who discovered this and this is the decisive point. And when he is doing this, it must have a big importance for him. But when you look in a lot of literature, it is not clear why this is so, it has such a big importance. And I try in this lecture here, I try to stress this importance. First, it is important because abstract labor is a purely social construction. It is not in any way natural. Marx hints when he speaks of abstract labor, labor in the physiological sense as spending brain and muscles, is misleading. Because it is not a natural thing, it is a social thing, insofar that abstract labor is the recognition of the privately spent individual labor of the commodity producer as a part of social labor. The private producer produces a use value and then tries to sell this use value in the market. Only when this selling process is successful, then his privately spent labor is recognized as a part of the total social labor. And what is the way in which this recognition is done? It is done insofar this privately spent labor is accepted as abstract labor. So, abstract labor is not just a social construction, it is a social construction which connects the Robinsons of the bourgeois society with the universal dependence of this Robinson. So, it is a decisive social construction. But as such a social construction, it is not easily to fix or to measure. And this is also a big point of weakness in a lot of traditional Marxist debates and contributions, that it is thought we can measure abstract labor just in hours with using our watches. But when we use our watch to measure labor time, which labor time do we measure then? We measure the labor time we can observe. We see someone is working, let us say a carpenter, producing a table. We measure he needs 5 hours for this table. But what then we had measured? We didn't measure abstract labor time, we measured the time of concrete labor which was necessary to produce this certain use value. The measure of abstract labor time is not possible in labor magnitudes, it is only possible in money. And this is a decisive point which Marx stresses in the first volume of Capital in chapter 3, where he introduces money as measure of value as a necessary, not to avoid measure of value. And in his earlier book about the critique of political economy, these first 2 chapters, which appeared in the year 1859, 8 years before volume 1 of Capital, he explicitly speaks about that the immediate form of existence of abstract labor is money. So this social construction, abstract labor, we can only measure by money, not by labor time. But this abstract labor as a social construction also has consequences for what Marx calls substance of value. When you read Capital, very early in the first chapter, Marx speaks about the substance of value, that abstract labor is substance of value. And again, in many contributions, this substance is understood as something which belongs to a single commodity. So we have this table produced as a commodity, and somewhere inside, wherever, is a certain amount of the substance of value. But this is definitely not meant by Marx. Already in the first few pages, he speaks of this substance as a common substance, not a substance you can find in an isolated commodity, a substance which is common in the exchange process when you exchange one commodity with another commodity. And this argument that you cannot speak of the substance of an isolated commodity, this is developed a little bit more extensively in his reworking manuscript, when he reworked the first edition of volume 1 of Capital to come to the second edition. The second edition shows a lot of changes to the first edition, and in this, and especially in the first chapters dealing with value theory. And there exists a very interesting manuscript in which Marx did the reworking and in which he gave commentaries to himself. Marx comments his own presentation in the first edition. He argues something is to be misunderstood, and therefore I have to change this and this, and indeed you find such changes then in the second edition. This manuscript, unfortunately, until now, is only published in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, this new big edition of all Marx and Engels works and manuscripts, which will not be such a small edition like the German MEW with 43 volumes. When this new mega will be finished, it will include 114 volumes. And there also this manuscript is published and unfortunately not translated. But in this introduction I wrote, and which will be in Croatian language ready at the end of this month, I used this manuscript and gave also some quotes from this regarding the point I'm speaking here, that substance, value substance, is not an attribute of a single commodity, it is a common attribute. Because it is a common attribute, it's, by the way, maybe this would be more interesting in the evening when I think it is the philosophical faculty. Yes, for philosophers, maybe it would be more interesting that the notion of substance Marx uses in Capital, in some respect also provides a basic critic for the mainstream debate on substance, starting with Aristotle. Marx was, he estimated Aristotle very much, and also in Capital, in the footnotes, you can find commentaries to Aristotle, but his notion of substance is definitely a critique of the discourse on substance, starting with Aristotle. But okay, this only as a side remark, because I'm not in a philosophical faculty here. This new idea, this new concept of substance has a lot of consequences. Now for the issues here, the most important consequence is that this substance, as a relational substance, is only visible, will only find a form of appearance in a relation. And this relation is what Marx calls the value form, the expression of value. The value of one commodity can only be expressed by a second commodity, and this relation is the value form. In chapter 1 of Capital, which is devoted to the commodity, this subsection on value form is the biggest subsection, and it is also the subsection to which Marx devoted most of his time, which was very often changed. He tried to be more precise. He starts in Grundrisse with it. It was reworked in the 59 text. It came in a much different form in the first edition of Capital. Then he changed a lot to the second edition. So this value form analysis had a big importance for Marx. But in the reception, in the literature about Marx, in the literature about Capital, we can say in the first 100 years it was nearly totally ignored. Only since the 1970s, in some circles, in some lines of discussion, this value form analysis plays an important role. In Germany, there starts in late 60s, early 70s, this so-called Neue Marx-Lektüre, new reading of Marx. And one of the important points for this new reading was to try to understand the importance of value form analysis. The older reception focused on substance in a very limited way, just to stress the substance of value is labor, not utility. Okay, it's true, but it depends what kind of labor and what kind of substance. In value form analysis, you see that the special character of this substance as a relational substance makes necessary value form, the expression of substance. But to come to an adequate expression of substance, it is not so easy. This is the content of this subsection of on value form. An adequate expression of value you can find only in money. Insofar, money is not just an additional to value, or like it is seen in bourgeois mainstream economics, money is a tool in order to make life easier. If we would try to exchange products directly, it would be very difficult when the butcher comes with the steak to the bakery, but the baker is a vegetarian, he doesn't want steak. It's very complicated. Money makes the life easier. This is the usual explanation when you are in a department on economics and you ask why do we use money, why we have money, then you will get such explanations. Marx tries to show that the importance of money is much, much more fundamental than just a helper in everyday life. value cannot exist, cannot become practically without relation to money. This is, by the way, also one of his main critics against Ricardo. Marx estimated Ricardo very much higher, I think, than he estimated Adam Smith. But in this point, he says Ricardo doesn't understand the relation between value, labor, and money, that they are inseparably connected. Ricardo connects value and labor, like the bulk of traditional Marxism is also doing, but he sees not a necessary connection to money. And this is the point Marx stresses in his critique against Ricardo. You can find in the second book of Theories of Surplus Value. So, in this Neue Marx-Lektüre in the 70s in Germany was the term coined monetary value theory to express this specificity of Marx value theory, that there is an inseparable connection between value and money. And in my work, among others, I tried to extend this concept of monetary value theory. It's not a term coined by Marx. You will nowhere find such a term in Marx. It is a term which tries to characterize an important point in Marx value theory. So, until now, I see time is running. Until now, I tried to show differences between Marx value theory and this classical labor theory of value, and also the dominant receptions of value theory in Marxist discussions. I spoke about the scope, which is different. I spoke about about labor, that the notion of labor changed by Marx to abstract labor, and that this had also consequences for the notion of, or the concept of substance. Now I want to come to two further consequences. The one is fetishism and the other is impersonal rule. The last subchapter of this first chapter on commodity in capital is called the fetish character of the commodity and its secret. And the notion commodity fetishism in the meantime is rather widespread, but in many cases I think not very well understood. First, when we talk about fetishism, we have to have in mind that in Marx days fetishism means something else than fetishism mostly means today. Today, when we speak about fetishism, our discussion is influenced by the studies of Sigmund Freud about fetishism. We think of some sexual obsessions with objects, and this is called fetishism. In Marx times, this notion of fetishism was completely unknown. Fetishism meant some so-called primitive religion views. These views, the European conquerors found, for example, in Africa, in some tribes, that they produced little pieces of wood or of leather, painted it, and then they were in fear of it because they thought that these things had magic forces, they had power about people, and you must be very cautious with it. And of course, the European colonial powers took this as a proof for the primitivity of such tribes. They produce a stick of wood and then they are in fear of it. So European colonialism is a good thing to bring culture, rationality to such primitive people. When Marx uses this term fetishism in Capital, on the one hand it has a polemical quality. He tries to show to the bourgeois society, look, you think you are so enlightened, you are so rational, but at the core of your society, in your economic system, you also have a certain kind of fetishism. So in some respect it was it had polemical reasons to use this word, but on the other hand it was also very precise to use this word. Why? Because there is really a kind of fetishism in the core of bourgeois society. The relations in a market society between producers are not immediate relation from person to person. They are relations mediated by things. In a market society, the private producers exchange their things. The social relation exists not between the persons, it exists between the things. And by this, the things receive social attributes. The things are made by humans, of course. That they have social attributes is a consequence of the structure of the market society. But nevertheless, these things and their attributes you can see, you can encounter in everyday life in bourgeois society. From the market movements, we are all dependent. The capitalist entrepreneurs are dependent from these market movements of prices of commodities. They decide if they can make a profit or not. The employed persons who sell the labor power to the capitalists are dependent because if their labor power is needed to make profit or not depends on these market movements. So we are all submitted to this rule of things. It is not an illusion, it is not a kind of ideology to say, oh, the things have social quality. No, in bourgeois society they really have social qualities, social attributes, because this society is structured in such a crazy way that humans who are dependent on each other are not in a direct contact, are not discussing what they need, what they want to produce, what they are able to produce, and so on. They are mediated by things. This mediation by things is not gives the commodities this social attribute, independent social attributes, and because the commodities need for their relation money, money is the most social thing in bourgeois society. In Grundrisse, Marx used the nice sentence to say, when we have money, it means that we can put our society in our bag. We have the society as a thing which we can put in our bag. And this is exactly the point, that the thing, money, no matter if it is a gold coin or a paper printed by the central bank, that this thing has social power. So fetishism is not an illusion. It is not a wrong consciousness, ideology or something. In the bourgeois society, in a capitalist market society, this fetishism, the rule of things, really is really existent. It is a reality. It has an elusive side, but just at a different point. This fetishism seems to be natural. It seems to be unavoidable. And here Marx speaks of in chapter 1 in Capital, he used the term phantasmagorie, a fantastic thing, an elusive thing, you can say, but not for the bourgeois society. There it's a reality, but for the idea that fetishism we have in every society. It is not to avoid. A nice example for this fetishism in the elusive sense is Adam Smith. Adam Smith, in his important work about the wealth of nations, discusses a lot of issues which are unusual for modern economic textbooks. For example, he discusses what is the difference between a human and an animal. And the answer of Adam Smith is the difference between a human being and an animal is the exchange. Animals, they struggle for things. Maybe they kill each other. But you never saw animals exchange things. Two dogs, maybe they struggle about a bone. But you never saw them exchange one big bone against two small bones or something like this. This is an attribute you find only with humans. So, to exchange things, to produce commodities, this makes humans to humans. And this is a perfect illustration for this kind of fetishism in the elusive sense. What we find in the bourgeois society, commodity producing, is generalized to a condition humaine, to a condition of human life. In this sense, fetishism is something what is wrong, what is an illusion. But in bourgeois society, fetishism is a reality. And this reality, I already gave the hint, so I can make this last point very short. And this reality can be seen very clearly in the impersonal relations of domination which are characterizing bourgeois society or capitalist societies. In all pre-capitalist societies, we have personal forms of domination and of rule. Just think of the example slave and master. The slave was personal property of the master. The master as a person had power, had was dominating the slave. When you compare this with modern relations, let us say the modern wage laborer and the capitalist, there is no personal rule, personal domination in this sense. The laborer has a treaty with the capitalist. He gives his or her labor force and receives a certain salary. And this treaty can be solved. The laborer can go out of the capitalist enterprise and can do something else, what the slave was not able to do. He was the personal property. So in so far, in capitalist relations, we have not personal domination, personal rule. And a lot of bourgeois thinkers, philosophers, political scientists see this already as the absence of domination and of rule. In capitalist society, we are all equal and free citizens. We have a government which we elect by our votes in the elections. There is a rule of the government, but this is not a personal rule. It is just that people give power for a certain time. I have a treaty with a capitalist for a certain time. I'm ready to follow the orders of the capitalist, but there is not a rule like slave and master. Marx doesn't deny this. He stresses this absence of personal rule, but he denies that this means the absence of any rule, of any domination. Instead of personal rule, capitalism is characterized by impersonal rule. You are ruled by structures. You are submitted to certain structures which you cannot avoid. With the wage laborer, it is very clear what this means. The wage laborer can solve the labor treaty with a single capitalist, of course. But as a wage laborer who has no other property than the own labor force, the wage laborer is dependent that he or she will find a capitalist to whom the labor force can be sold. So, what is a remarkable difference between ancient slavery and modern wage salary? Both the slave and the modern wage laborer is exploited. But the ancient slave tries to escape. He tries to flee from the master. The modern wage laborer is looking for a capitalist so that he can sell his labor power to him. The one tries to escape, the other tries to find someone who is exploiting him. And this is just the consequence of this impersonal rule. There is a society formed by independent producers. It is by the state fully guaranteed that everybody has his or her property. The property is secured by the state, and you have the right to valorize your property in every way you can do. Okay, but for one big class, the only possibility to valorize the property is to sell his or her labor force. And so, by the rule of this structure, people try to get exploited, while in ancient times, people try to escape from exploitation. But this, to be submitted to this impersonal rule, holds not only for the wage laborers, it holds also for the capitalists. The capitalists are also submitted to this impersonal rule. The capitalists in their enterprises try not only to reach profit, they try to reach maximum profit. They do this not out of personal greediness. Maybe some persons show this greediness, but this is not the decisive point. Even if you are a very ascetic person, when you become a capitalist, you are forced to try to find the maximum profit in order that you can maintain the competition with other capitalists, that you have enough money for investments to modernize your machines, to conquer new markets. If you don't do this, if you are ready to stay with what you have, you will be lost in a competitive capitalist market. So, also this ruling class, the capitalists, are submitted to impersonal rule. This is something very different from pre-capitalist societies. Now, this means not that we should feel pity for the bad situation of the capitalists, but it should direct our political critique to capitalism. When we formulate critique against capitalism, we should always think it is not the point of persons that we have to criticize how greedy, how mean the capitalists are. Maybe they are even nice, friendly persons. Our critique has to aim the basic structures which provoke, which makes necessary certain patterns of behavior. And these structures, they start not, I focused now on capitalist relations, but they start not only in capitalist relations, they start already in commodity relations. And this is the last remark, and then I really stop this lesson. The critique Marx formulates against capitalism is a critique which starts not only at the capitalist relations, that we have to get rid of the capitalists, of capitalist exploitation. The critique Marx formulates already starts with commodity production. It starts with value theory. Impersonal rule starts already when we produce our use values in the form of commodities. Insofar, and this maybe is even an actual discussion, maybe a lot of things sound to you rather abstract, rather theoretical, what I introduced here, but they have very practical consequences when we really want to get off capitalism. To get rid of capitalism, then we also have to get rid of commodity production. So, kinds of market socialism, which were discussed in the left in the last 100 years, at least from the perspective of Marxian analysis, are doomed to fail, just to reproduce the old capitalist structures. And insofar, to get rid of capitalism means also to get rid of commodity production. And I think this is the political clue of this Marxian value theory, which I tried to highlight in some aspects at this lesson.